Welcome to The Lost Debate, a show for political eclectics. I'm Ravi Gupta, and today I'm joined again by Dr. Dhruv Khullar from The New Yorker and Cornell. He is a practicing physician, and he has the sort of cherished seat that used to belong to Atul Gawande at The New Yorker, where he just writes long-form articles about the major health issues of the day. And we talk about ultra-processed foods, and I think that conversation is going to leave you with a lot to think about your diet. It certainly has changed the way I think about my diet. And just a question of like, what are ultra processed foods doing to us? And are they bad for us? So I think you're going to get a lot out of this conversation. Let's jump right in. Dhruv, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
You wrote this article titled, "Why is the American Diet So Deadly?" And you focus on this sort of category of foods called ultra processed foods. Let's start by just defining our terms here. What is an ultra-processed food?
Sure. So I think when people hear ultra-processed foods, they're often just have this idea that it's junk food in their mind. And that's part of the story, but actually there's a very specific scientific definition now for ultra-processed food. And it's helpful to step back and just try to understand where this came from. So basically, no one was really talking about ultra-processed foods in the way that they are today until 2009. And there was a Brazilian epidemiologist who put this idea on the map. And now, of course, ultra-processed foods and discussions of ultra-processed foods is pretty much everywhere. But he came up with this framework. So there's four kind of categories of food. And as you move up the categories, it becomes ultra-processed. So the first group, what he calls group 1 foods, are unprocessed foods. So just things that basically come out of nature. So nuts and eggs and vegetables, basically minimally processed, unprocessed food. Group 2 then is culinary ingredients. And these are things like olive oil, sugar, butter, salt. So if you put some salt and some butter on your pasta, which is unprocessed, you get then group 3 food. So that's 1 + 2 = 3. And so butter, salt, pasta, that's group 3 food. It's technically processed. You have put something into this food, you've cooked the food, it's a processed food, but that's not really what we're talking about. So then there's that final level, which is the fourth level, which is group 4 foods, and those are ultra-processed foods. And the idea here is that these are types of foods that you would not be able to cook in your home kitchen, either because you don't have those types of ingredients or you don't have those types of processes to prepare food in that way. And so there's a lot of often kind of unnatural ingredients: modified cornstarch, whey protein, sodium phosphate, hydrogenated oils, high fructose corn syrup. And these are basically when whole foods are refined, chemically modified, broken apart in some way, and that's what gives you that ultra-processed food. And according to the definition, at least, even if you have one such ingredient in the food, it's technically considered an ultra-processed food.
And before we talk about some of the downsides or potential risks of eating these types of foods, why do we even have them? Like, what is the both commercial case for them, like for the companies that sell them, and is there any end use case for us? Like, is there any benefit from a general sense from eating these ultra processed foods?
Well, one thing to note is that different countries have them in different proportions. And so we have some of the highest rates of ultra processed food in the American diet compared to, let's say, most European countries. And so by some estimates, 60 to 70% of the American diet is considered ultra processed. That might be like a third in France or a fourth in Spain. And so we do have much higher rates of ultra processed food, and we have the obesity rates to show it, I guess. So there are reasons that processing can be helpful. I mean, the generous takes are that you can transport food more easily. It stays longer on the shelf. So there are things that food companies do either to promote the a certain type of texture. So often you can think about things like emulsifiers and thickeners giving you a particular mouthfeel, so it can make food more palatable. Often these ingredients are cheaper than whole foods, and so that's another reason that they might want to use them. They extend the shelf life, and so a bread that's ultra processed might remain longer on the shelf than one that you bake with totally natural ingredients at home. And then there are things like, they can make them more visually appealing. So if you use certain food dyes, let's say, that can make things bright in a way that is visually appealing, particularly for children, that a more dull brown or gray color would not be. And so these are the types of reasons that we have seen a rise in ultra-processed food and the use of some of these processes and ingredients in the American diet.
And so you profile a series of scientists and medical experts. who are asking a particular question. I'm going to take a stab at what the question is here. I imagine you're going to have to revise it, but it's basically, is there something about ultra-processed foods beyond the macronutrients involved and the caloric content of them that is uniquely bad? So, like, if you were to just, like, take an ultra-processed food, say how much protein, how much carbs, how much fat is in it, and then how many calories it is, and compare it to a non-processed, you'd think that, there's something beyond that comparison that tells us that ultra-processed foods are doing something bad for our bodies. Is that roughly what the question is?
That's roughly correct. So the idea is that one could ask a question, or one could argue that ultra-processed foods are just bad because they have more fat and cholesterol and salt and sugar. But that's not the question that's being asked here. The question is, let's control for all those things. So let's have an ultra-processed diet, and let's have an unprocessed diet, or a minimally processed diet. And let's basically try to match those things for salt and sugar and protein and fiber and all these things that we think of as the key nutrients that are good or bad for your health. But one of those diets is going to be ultra-processed, and one is going to be minimally processed. And so we're really trying to isolate, as you're saying, the effect of ultra-processing as opposed to the effect of individual nutrients. And so there's this researcher at the NIH named Kevin Hall, who's a senior investigator there, and he's really led a lot of this work. And so in the past, a lot of the work has been mostly survey-based research. Not his work, but most of the ultra-processed food work is, you ask thousands of people, 100,000 people, what did they remember eating? And if there's more ultra-processed food, and you control for various things, and you try to see, okay, what was the impact of ultra-processed food on their health outcomes? What he's doing is bringing, a dozen, 2 dozen people into the lab, into the NIH. They live there for 2 or 4 weeks. And for some of those weeks, they get ultra-processed, and some of those weeks, they get unprocessed diets. And the big study that came out, recently showed that basically people who are on an ultra-processed diet, they eat 500 calories more per day. And remember, these are the similar types of levels of salt and sugar, cholesterol, fat, all these things, but they just eat many more calories than you would on a minimally processed diet. They end up putting on weight, 2 pounds in just 2 weeks, basically, while minimally processed diet people, when they're on that diet, they lose 2 pounds. So people on the ultra-processed diet, they tend to eat their meals much faster, and that gets back to the idea of, the texture of the food. And then they also have different levels of hormones and glucose circulating in their blood. And so if you're in their blood, so if you're on an ultra-processed diet, you have more sugar that's entered your bloodstream. Hormones that are trying to suppress your appetite, those are lower than they would be otherwise. And so there's hints that there's this all these kind of varied effects on the body, but the headline finding here is ultra-processed diet, you tend to eat more calories. Now, I just want to throw in a couple of wrinkles here. One is that it's not clear that 500 calories a day number would last forever. So, our bodies adapt, our psychologies adapt, our physiology adapts. So you can't just say, for the rest of your life, you'll eat 500 more calories per day. And in fact, if you were to extrapolate that, people would, weigh 1,000 pounds. And so it doesn't totally make sense. But the idea is that there is probably some increase in calorie consumption on the ultra-processed diet.
Yeah, and actually, it's a good opportunity to pause and talk about, you talk about the NIH we were talking about in segment 1. This is like a perfect example of research that doesn't really have a commercial application. So it's like squarely in where we probably want the NIH, right? Like there's not a lot of companies out there. Like there's so many companies that make money off of processed food. So this is kind of cuts in the other direction. But the obvious question is, well, why are people putting on more weight and eating more calories from ultra-processed food? What is it about that food that's making us eat more?
So there's a really interesting new study underway by Kevin Hall and others, and it's trying to get at that exact question. And what they've found basically so far is that there's 2 factors about ultra-processed foods that seem to be driving excess calorie consumption. The first is calorie density. And so if you just have more calories per every bite, obviously you're going to eat more calories, and your body's going to have a harder time sending the signals to your brain and to your gut that, hey, I'm getting full. You can slow down on food because you've already in the first 5 or 10 or 15 bites taken in many more calories than you would if you were just eating a plain salad.
And on this front, can you make it like tangible for us? Like, what's an example of 2 types of food, one processed and one ultra processed where it's like roughly the same thing, but it's like the ultra processed version of it is going to be more dense?
Yeah. So so there are many different ways you could think about this. I mean, so one would just be something like meats versus processed meat. And so you could have like a slice of turkey, or you could have turkey sausage, and the turkey sausage would probably be much more calorie dense than the slice of turkey. Of course, there are many, there's even more stark examples of this. And so obviously, if you're having a salad, your jaw gets tired by the time you get to 500 calories of munching on salad. If you have basically a bag of Doritos or a Twinkie, you can basically scarf that down in, let's say 30 seconds. So I think there's a big spectrum, but even as you're saying, if it's a similar type of food, you can eat many more calories per bite than you otherwise would. I mean, even if you think about something like a whole grain bread versus a, soft white bread, you might be able to eat the white bread much more quickly than you would the whole wheat bread, because it's got more fiber, it's got more texture, it's harder for your just to even chew it and swallow it. So, calorie density is a big part of this, and I think probably the most important factor. The other factor I want to point to is something called hyperpalatability. And again, that the lay definition might be tastes really good, hyperpalatable, but there's a specific kind of scientific definition, which is you have combinations of salt and sugar, or salt and fat, or fat and sugar in high proportions that you wouldn't usually find in nature. So if you have a grape in nature, it's pretty high in sugar, but not a lot of fat, not a lot of salt in it. You have a cheesecake, it's got everything in it. It's got salt, sugar, and fat, and it's hyperpalatable. And so that's probably the other big thing that is driving excess calorie consumption. So those are the two big ideas: is that calorie density and hyperpalatability drive excess calorie consumption.
Now, how do people know something is ultra processed or not? Like, obviously, a lot of the examples you just mentioned, they're going to know Doritos are processed, but is there a simple method for people to identify these foods?
So reading the calorie labels is going to be the easiest way to do that. And I would really advise people to try to do that, because when I was reporting this story, there were so many foods that I thought were totally healthy and clean and natural that ended up actually being ultra processed. And so if you see an ingredient that you don't have in your home kitchen, basically, or wouldn't have in your home kitchen, that is one way very quickly to know that this is an ultra processed food. And some things like, yogurts, some types of bread. I've recently started buying a new type of whole wheat bread that happens to be ultra processed. A lot of the yogurts, as I mentioned, some types of oatmeal, some types of granola, all these things, they could be minimally processed, or there's no reason that they can't be. But for the reasons that we talked about earlier, things like shelf life, things like hyperpalatability, things like driving sales, they often are ultra processed. And so reading the calorie label is really important. I want to make just one other point here, is that there is a risk of overlearning this lesson, in the sense that, as I mentioned, it's a huge category. And so gummy bears are ultra processed, and a low-fat yogurt with one emulsifier is also ultra processed. And it's definitely not clear that those are equally bad for you. And so it's not even clear that actually something like yogurt that has one ingredient that is unnatural, or whole wheat bread that has one ingredient that's unnatural, is any worse than the equivalent that it doesn't have those ingredients. And so we should really, I think the next step that the field needs to take is really try to drill down on the things within the ultra processed category that are really bad. Right now, what I would say is that there's the obvious stuff that's like junk food. So if you're just eating cookies and chips, obviously that's bad. But people should be aware that sugar-sweetened beverages, I think that's the other big category I would advise people to stay away from, and things like processed meats. Those probably have the strongest evidence that those things are harming our health.
Yeah, when people read the article, you can see that there are, some of these studies are, depending on what risk you're looking into, right? So you talk about cardiovascular disease. It's what you just talked about: sugary sodas, processed meats versus breads, cold cereals, certain dairy products like yogurt that actually decrease, or at least according to that study, cardiovascular risk. A good example here is Cheerios, which I actually love Cheerios, and it's when I'm traveling, I often will just pick up a big box of Cheerios because I feel like it's like a relatively safe bet. And I've been having these arguments with people in my life. It's like, are Cheerios healthy? And I've actually gone down a rabbit hole, and I actually don't know the answer to it. Cheerios claims it lowers cardiovascular risk if you see and I'm talking about regular Cheerios, not Honey Nut Cheerios. And I asked ChatGPT, I went to Healthline, I couldn't figure it out, but I think it's very much in the middle of this debate, what you're talking about, which is it's obviously very different than processed meats, right? But it also has some chemicals in it that I don't really know what they are. And I think that's the overlearning mechanism, right? Which is like, if I'm on the road, I grab Cheerios. Should I really be that worried? I mean, you tell me.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. So there are definitely many cereals that use artificial dyes that have much more sugar than something like Cheerios. So on the spectrum of, cereals that you could choose, I think that's probably the right one to grab for. I think this can cut in a number of different directions. I mean, so one thing that I've heard, I think Michael Pollan made this point, is that if a food is making health claims, probably best to stay away from it. It's probably not good for your health. Because companies, what they can do is say, basically sprinkle or add some fiber. Let's say fiber sounds good. Let's add it to a very sugary cereal and call it a health food. Or vitamin water. Vitamins are good for you, but it also has basically as much sugar as a can of Coke. And so there is this way in which something called nutritionism, when you're too hyper-focused on individual nutrients, you miss the kind of forest for the trees. You miss this idea that there are actually, what we want to drive towards is more whole foods and foods that, we're used to eating and that don't kind of hijack our brain chemistry and our physiology in really unnatural ways. The last point I want to make on this is, so we talked a lot about ultra-processed foods and these ingredients maybe just making you eat more for, calorie density reasons or hyperpalatability reasons. But there's a lot of interesting, I think, provocative science that's being done that's not settled science, but I want to just raise a few other hypotheses that people have raised about ways in which ultra-processed foods might change our body. So one is changes to the microbiome. And so it's possible that some of these ingredients that we're not used to digesting are changing the bacteria in our gut in important ways that alter the way that we process food, which is important to continue to investigate. The second is changes to our endocrine systems. And so does it change the insulin that's circulating in our body, the sensitivity to insulin, increase, hunger hormones, reduce satiety hormones? Do some of these ingredients kind of play with our endocrine system in important and meaningful ways? And the last is changes to our taste buds. And so, if your taste buds can change over time. And if they're used to getting huge hits of salt and sugar, they may get used to that, in the same way that if you are using a drug, you develop a tolerance and you need a bigger and bigger hit to be satisfied. And so these are other types of mechanisms where, even if, let's say, you're not eating more and you are controlling calories, it can still have changes potentially on your body in ways that we're still trying to figure out.
Is this part of the paradox? And you allude to this in your article of often when I travel to other countries, France or Italy or whatever, it's not like people are drinking smoothies, they're eating bread and pastries and pasta and all this kind of stuff. Could this processed piece be part of that equation?
Yeah, I think so. I think, I wrote 7,000 words on this or something like that, and people have written books. I really think that Michael Pollan's 7 works are still basically all you need for nutrition, which is, eat food, mostly plants, not too much. And if you do those basically 3 things, and by eat food, he means eat real food, not eat food like edible substances, which are, what's floating around a lot. But that's basically it. And if the more that you can do that, the better. Now, not everyone has the opportunity to do that. Our choices are constrained by our environment, and our food environment is one that is, in my opinion, very destructive and harmful to our health. And so we need to try to make sure that people have access to healthy food, that making the healthy choice is the easy one, that both the price decreases, but also the convenience increases. And so there are ways in which we need to help people operationalize that kind of short axiom. But I think in terms of advice, I haven't heard better advice than that.
Well, Dhruv, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Well, thank you, everybody, for listening. Remember to rate, review, subscribe. Our voicemail is 321-200-0570. Our email is lostdebate@thebranchmedia.org. Thank you very much, everybody.